My guest today is Senator Henry Seriake Dickson, the Niger Delta politician who was a state attorney general, member of the House of Representatives, and subsequently governor of Bayelsa State for 8 years, from 2012 to 2020, before becoming the senator representing Bayelsa West in the 9th National Assembly. But his career has taken him to several other places before politics. He used to be a police officer and a lawyer before he made the jump into politics. So with all that experience, what's he done with it in a world in which many Nigerians believe that their political leaders are not just incapable, but actively, consciously incapable of doing anything for their people? I'll be joined in the studio by Henry Seriake Dickson, current senator and lawyer, former governor, former member of the House of Reps, former state attorney general, and former police officer. I'm Charles Aniagolu, and this is the Arise interview. Now, my guest today is a conspicuous figure in Nigerian politics, having been a state attorney general, a member of the House of Representatives, a 2-term governor, as well as now a senator. You could say that Henry Seriake Dickson could rank as one of the more important figures in Nigeria's former ruling party, the People's Democratic Party, or PDP, which has been struggling to emerge from the defeat it experienced at the hands of the now ruling All Progressives Congress, or APC, in 2015. But whatever the PDP's political anguish and torment today, as it battles to re-establish and re-exert itself, Senator Dickson has never portrayed himself in the public arena as lacking in purpose. He's become a sort of spokesman on issues such as justice, the right to education, electoral and constitutional reform, devolution of powers, and restructuring. And I'm delighted to say that Senator Seriake Dickson joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Charles, for having me. Thank you.
And I just referred there in the intro to you being very keen on electoral and constitutional reform. And those two things are inextricably linked, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They are. Because, I mean, if you look at our history, particularly our recent history, not many Nigerians are aware that in 1999, when this current democratic dispensation was ushered in by General Abdul Salam, the last military ruler, politicians in all parties, including elected officials, didn't have a glimpse of the document that they would govern this country by.
That's the Constitution.
The Constitution was not published until Chief Obasanjo, who was president, took his oath 29th May. In other words, all the politicking that went on, campaigns and everything that went on, took place without the governing basic document.
That's worrying.
Yes, that was what happened. It's quite some time, about 20-something years, and people may have forgotten. And that's why we are, making the case for a profound, comprehensive constitutional review in Nigeria. I mean, you can call it different names. You can call it devolution. You can call it restructuring. Whatever term you use, what it connotes is a need to return, to an examination, a comprehensive examination of the governing basic document, by which Nigerians are to be governed by. And you are right. In it, you also need to address issues such as electoral reform, which for me is one of the key things I came back to the National Assembly to pursue. And I'm in the committee, we're making some progress. I'm in the committee working on I'm actually a member of the committee of the Senate on elections, on INEC, so.
But let's then talk about that electoral reform, because I'm sure you've seen and heard those feelings of anger and disillusion that we've seen trailing the passage of that Electoral Act Amendment Bill.
Yes. Well, first of all, at the committee level, I came to join them in a by-election I didn't start from the beginning with this 9th Senate, regrettably. I was still back home when we did elections. And when there was a vacancy, I came in January, effectively, this year. At which time, my colleagues in the committee, I think in both chambers, had done a very exhaustive work with the support of civil society groups and donor agencies and so on. I mean, public hearings, a lot of partners came in and they had worked on a comprehensive review of the Electoral Act, the last one. So I met a very well-prepared document. But in it, we had issues about some clauses. And particularly when there were concerns that a certain clause had been tampered with. I mean, dealing with electronic voting, dealing with e-transmission of results, and a few other thorny issues. And we had to deal with that at the committee level. And I know the roles I played, my colleagues know. And we all decided to bring back, you know, the clause that will permit us or permit INEC, the electoral body, to conduct elections electronically, transmit electronically. And some of us were the authors of the phrase, I mean, transmitting wherever and whenever applicable. Because our colleagues in the committee raised the issues of lack of network in some areas,
lack of connectivity,
lack of connectivity in some areas, and also the possibility of hacking. And I said, well, these are valid concerns, and they are not regional, they are not sectional. We should all be concerned about the sanctity, about the security of the transmission lines and all of that. So we now came up with wherever and whenever INEC would do that, we should give them the legal capacity to do so. And that was what we presented on the floor. But it
didn't work, though, did it?
On the floor. But on the floor, I think, again, the issue of concerns about lack of connectivity, as you put it, came up. And then an amendment was introduced, which we disagree with. I mean, if you look at the voting, I made it very clear that it was unconstitutional to subject INEC to NCC or any other regulatory agency, because the Constitution in the schedules has made it very clear that INEC shall be independent, and INEC has the sole responsibility for conducting, supervising, organizing elections. So, as it is, I think it's somehow also the problem of INEC. Because we didn't have a legal framework before they introduced card readers in 2015, for example. And that goes normally with their constitutional powers to organize and conduct elections. But this time, I think we needed to be clearer, if you like, in case INEC doubted their legal capacity to introduce technology. But let me say that in both houses, at least the one we passed in the Senate, we have provided for electronic voting. Not many Nigerians are talking about that. In the Senate version...
Yeah, but the electronic voting has been there. I mean, it's been used in previous elections.
Not electronic voting as in going to vote electronically.
Right.
It was, what INEC did was to introduce card readers.
Right.
And, well, that is also introduction of technology.
Yes, it is.
Which is why I have the view that INEC does not really even need express legal powers, as in the electoral amendment, to be able to deploy technology. They've already done so in 2015. And they can actually deploy and even transmit electronically without even this contentious amendment.
Yeah, but the fact that it's now been put into law,
yes,
that would be a problem for INEC, wouldn't it?
Well, as I said on the floor of the Senate while casting my vote for electronic transmission, I made it clear that any resolution, any purported attempt to circumvent or subscribe the powers of INEC and place it under the supervisory jurisdiction of another agency is illegal and will be unconstitutional. And I have no doubt that if such matters go before the courts, I have a clear idea of what the courts will say.
Well, I'm wondering what information you and your colleagues as members of the committee had whilst you were working on this document? Because, I mean, it's amazing that INEC has said that it can electronically transmit election results. It says it's tested it last year in the Edo governorship election, and it worked. The Association of Licensed Telecoms Operators of Nigeria have also said that the telecoms companies have the capacity to transmit election results electronically across Nigeria. And yet the Senate voted against that clause. Why would they have done that? Just explain a little bit about the politics and the considerations at play here.
Well, you know, Charles, firstly, you need to understand my position and where I stand on this issue, which is firstly, as I've said even here now, that in the first place, I believe that INEC already has legal capacity to conduct elections electronically and to transmit same without any amendment of the Electoral Act. Otherwise, why did they do that in Edo? There was no Electoral Act amendment. So that confirms my basic view, and which is why I feel that the amendment that sought to bring INEC's operations and activities, albeit about transmission, under the supervision of NCC, of course I disagree clearly with it. And a lot of my colleagues also disagreed. But you know, when a voting takes place on the floor, I mean, some position has to be upheld and another overruled.
And how did you vote?
Unfortunately, that was what happened. But it doesn't change my views that INEC can go ahead to conduct elections electronically if and only if they determine that to be practicable, to be feasible, to be secure. I feel that in matters like this, and I told the committee agreed. It was on that basis that that phrase, INEC having the powers to do so wherever and whenever, was put there in our draft report today, because ultimately it is not the National Assembly that has the expertise, as you rightly pointed out, to determine whether INEC can conduct elections electronically or whether INEC can transmit same electronically.
Yeah, but they've now
it's a judgment for INEC.
Yeah, but they've now passed it on to NCC.
Well, that is why I disagree with that position. Right there on the floor, and we voted against it. I believe that my colleagues who voted for that did so on the wrong premise, but as it is by our procedures, that unfortunately, as unpalatable as it is the position of the Senate.
Right, but can we now say that the issue of the electronic transmission of election results is now pretty much dead in the National Assembly? Or can President, obviously Buhari, still use the so-called bully pulpit to shift the National Assembly? Is he even inclined to do so from your assessment?
Well, I'm not a presidential spokesman.
Sure, I know that.
Yes, but I can assess. All Nigerians can assess. I mean, all lovers of Nigeria have also assessed. Don't forget that the 8th Senate did also a lot of work on the Electoral Act amendment before the last general elections. And this document was presented to the president for his presidential accent. And for several reasons, this president withheld accent. So, I don't think we're encouraged to be optimistic that the bully pulpit, which is available to the president to use to rally the country to do whatever is in the national interest, will be exercised.
Okay.
But however, I believe
we must take a break. I apologize.
Right,
we'll come back and we'll continue from where you stopped.
Thank you.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Senator Seriake Dickson, former governor of Bayelsa State. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, my guest today is Senator Henry Seriake Dickson, senator representing Bayelsa West and former governor of Bayelsa State. He governed the state for 8 years, and he's been in the thick of all the latest hot-button controversial issues at the National Assembly. Disappointment and reproach continuing to trail the passage of Nigeria's Electoral Act Amendment Bill. For instance, there have been calls for President Buhari not to assent to the bill because it is argued lawmakers sought to tamper with the independence of INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission. The impression seems to be that legislators, rather than making elections in Nigeria better, have effectively torpedoed the credibility of the process, knowing that Nigerian elections have in the past been manipulated in the course of the collation of results manually and the transmission of results physically. And Senator Seriake Dickson, former governor of Bayelsa State, is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And you were completing a thought before we went on a break about this Electoral Amendment Act.
Yes, so I was saying that even before you call on the president to use his bulletproof, the legislative process known to our Constitution has not been completed, has not been exhausted. As you know, the Senate and the House passed two different versions.
So it's got to be harmonized.
Meaning that there has to be a conference committee to harmonize these positions. And if what comes out, for example, is the House version, which is basically what we had on the conference report, which is that the discretion to decide whether or not to deploy technology should vest rightly and constitutionally with INEC and no one else. So that process is still there before you get to talk about the president. But the president, as you know, the president in our system is a lot of several things together. He's president, he's commander-in-chief of the armed forces, he's head of states of the country, and he is the leader of country. Which is why presidential input, presidential direction, presidential initiative is important. If we have that, I mean, in sufficient quantum in this matter, that would be very helpful to the national cause.
So you think that's absent then, do you?
Well, we haven't seen enough of it. We should see more.
Right.
We deserve more.
And I wonder if you and your colleagues ever actually feel the mood of the nation and touch the pulse of anger and disillusion when this sort of vote happens. Do you guys feel that in your everyday work as lawmakers?
Well, you know, Charles, you need to know that the National Assembly is a political institution.
Yeah, of course it is.
Yes.
But it's a political institution that represents the people.
Yes.
You've all got constituents.
It's a political institution.
Right.
And therefore it's very susceptible to see differences of views and perspectives.
Yeah, of course.
And nowhere do you see that much more than the legislature. Because of the divergence, because of the different experiences and the expectations different people have. But in the midst of it, I'm one of those who believe that, you see, you bring all these different perspectives, and when you meet at the national platform, you dissolve it in order to craft the national agenda. Are we doing enough of that in this country? No. Sadly, no. Now, what happened in the with respect to this and also the PIB, which I believe we'll talk about, it's not appropriate. I didn't support that position, as you all know. I believe that INEC should be empowered, should be supported, should be encouraged to deploy technology, and should be seen to be independent. Not only independent in fact, but everyone should see INEC to be truly speaking independent. And this amendment, particularly from the Senate, which I didn't support, appears not to have served that direction.
Well, let's move away from that, because you mentioned something very interesting and very hopeful, and that is that there is still the stage. I mean, I think a lot of people were aware of that anyway, but there is still the harmonization stage where there could be changes made that would better reflect what the people of Nigeria appear to want. That same thing could also apply to the PIB, could it?
No. Unfortunately, the PIB has passed through that stage. And again, you know, we've got to put the facts correctly out there. The PIB, you know, was a legislation, a comprehensive legislation, a one-stop legislation to regulate the oil industry. Well thought of by the former president, late Yaradua, and perhaps even some work before him. And did a lot of work, a lot of experts worked on it. I was in the House of Reps when the PIB was introduced. And then work went on. But it could not be passed for different reasons, several reasons. Couldn't pass it, unfortunately.
Took over a decade.
Sadly so. And that speaks again to, clarity of vision, and then the need for national consensus and solidarity in addressing very important national issues.
And of course, one of those very important issues is the 3% that was proposed for the host communities, the percentage of oil revenues. You walked out of the Senate during the session of that PIB, the Petroleum Industry Bill, amid all the uproar and the disagreements. You proposed 5%, and you got 3%. And you staged a walkout in protest. Outline for us briefly how you felt about all that.
Now let's go back to the history, where it started, which is what I was trying to do. President Yaradua submitted a draft bill for the PIB. And what did he propose on these critical areas? Host Community Fund, and also the Fund for the Frontier Development. Late President Yaradua from Katsina State, just like the current president, proposed 10% for communities, Host Community Fund. Okay? And also about 10% for Frontier Development. That was what Yaradua proposed. And some of us, not only because Yaradua became president in 2007, at the same time I also left as Attorney General to join the National Service as a member of the House of Reps and all that. So I have a clear idea of some of the things that went on, particularly those that needed legislative input. Now, Yaradua also created the Ministry of Niger Delta. Yaradua, of blessed memory, and God continued to bless his soul, also granted amnesty, which is what has underpinned the relative stability in the Niger Delta region. So it was a whole package. Now, there were other issues that because he died, couldn't be followed through, unfortunately. We can't talk about that. Now, this bill suffered until now. This present president, President Buhari, in his first draft to the National Assembly, proposed 5% for host communities development. 5%. And now, as I said, when I came to join the Senate, January this year, they had already done a lot of work. The committees involved had done a lot of exhaustive work. The PIB is a very technical bill. And yes, we disagree with them on these specific issues, but we should also acknowledge the amount of intellectual work that has gone in over the years. And then they proposed 3%, actually 2.5%. That's what the latest proposal had. And at the Southern Senators level, and I'm not spokesman for that Southern Senators Forum, and we also met at the South Senators.
Very briefly, because we've got 10 seconds to take a break.
And then we all met, and a lot of lobbying took place, as you would imagine, in the parliament. And I was one of those that were given the responsibility. There was no key member of the Senate that I and my colleagues didn't meet to interact with.
Right, and you still didn't work.
Well, they agreed on 5%. They agreed on 5%. Unfortunately, on that day before the vote,
something went wrong.
Something went wrong.
Okay, let's continue when we come back.
Okay.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Senator Seriake Dickson, former two-term governor of Bayelsa State. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. My guest today is Senator Henry Seriake Dickson, the Niger Delta politician who was a state attorney general, member of the House of Representatives, and subsequently governor of Bayelsa State for 8 years, from 2012 to 2020. He is now, of course, back in the National Assembly, but in the upper house as the senator representing Bayelsa West in the 9th National Assembly. But his career has taken him to several other places before politics. He used to be a police officer and a lawyer before he made the jump into politics. So a man who's garnered considerable experience. But of course, this is Nigeria, a world in which many citizens believe that their political leaders are not just incapable, but actively, consciously incapable of doing anything for their people. So the question must be, what has he done with all that experience, having transferred it into the political arena? And Senator Dickson is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. I'm not going to ask you that question yet, because we're going to get to talk a little bit about you. But you were talking about the Petroleum Industry Bill.
Yes.
And your argument is that the 2% difference between 3% and 5% doesn't serve the national interest, and that it could cost Nigeria dearly in terms of the management of security of the Niger Delta region. What exactly did you mean by that?
Exactly. Before I come to that, Charles, I was saying that on that morning, we had gone around almost all the caucuses in the Senate, and I was one of the leaders. On behalf of the South-South senators, on behalf of the Southern Nigeria senators, we had interacted with all of them gave us our word before the morning of that discussion. In the morning of that discussion, the leadership told us they were allowing the Minister of Petroleum, who incidentally is from my state, former governor, Chief Silva, and the GMD NNPC, they both came in. Well, presumably to give some technical, update on the bill, but ended up saying emphatically that the host communities development fund should be nowhere more than 2.5% as originally proposed by the executive. And that if it was higher than that, there would be no investment inflow into the oil and gas sector. That statement, coming from the oil and gas eggheads, had a major influence on the minds of the senators.
But don't you think that's a realistic statement?
No, it is not realistic. And this is what I mean. But the Senate upped it with 0.5 and made it 5%. We disagreed with it. I walked out on that day as well, and a number of other senators quietly. It was quiet because there was room in our legislative processes for harmonization. The House had passed 5%. Here we had passed 3%. And we knew there was going to be a conference committee. So we intensified the lobby. And the vote tied. But the leader of the team, incidentally, the Senate leader, who was chairman of the conference committee, cast the deciding ballot and brought it back to 3%. Now, my view is that the difference between 3%, which is what has been harmonized by both chambers, and the 5% that was contained in the report following our lobby. Remember, the executive wanted 2.5%. We lobbied and got both committees to raise it to 5%. And the House did very well. I must thank all of them for that. But the harmonization was done and then brought it to 3%. And that's why I said that 2%, the opportunity cost of that 2% does not serve the national interest. I have been two-term governor, 8 years, in Bayelsa, which is like the center of the Niger Delta
I've been to
challenges.
Bayelsa.
Yes.
I've been to Aniagolu.
The center of the Niger Delta challenges and potentials. You find it in Bayelsa. And I've been involved in all forms. So I know what a number of these guys who voted for this do not know and can never know, which is that if you don't have the buy-in of the communities and the people who feel aggrieved of all these over 60 years of exploitation, and now they are before their eyes, this is the first time funds are made available directly to the communities. They saw when President Yar'Adua made a report for 10%. They saw also when this same president in this government, led by this party, requested for 5%. They are aware of it. And you now, in the National Assembly, based on the projections, based on the advice or the opinions of NNPC and the Oil Ministry, Petroleum Ministry, you now on your own reduce it to 2%. That 2% does not make sense, because you're going to spend more than that in terms of managing security, in terms of managing community.
In other words, the fallout from the removal of that 2% will be much greater than what it would have cost.
Far greater.
So does it then, because I mean the Niger Delta where you come from, security challenges have simmered for years there. They've always agitated for a greater share of the profit from Nigeria's biggest foreign exchange earner, which obviously is oil. And oil, of course, produced in the Niger Delta. Do you think militants still pose a threat and a security challenge in the region? Because there have been warnings that militancy appears to be picking up again there.
Now, Niger Delta is always prone to instability.
Right.
I mean, you now have a situation where, paradoxically, Charles, the Niger Delta region appears to be one of the safest places in Nigeria as we speak today.
Until elections arrive.
Today. And that is about, it's largely due to what President Yar'Adua did. The people trusted him. The young people keyed in. The elders also keyed in. And the amnesty program is still on course. It is still running. Other components of it, we may have had challenges in its implementation, but largely speaking, the young people still believe in the system and they are managing it. But it still remains a volatile system. It has enormous potentials for combustion, and which is why any sensible country would not try what we have tried to do here now. But I mean, by reducing it from 5% to 3%. What are you going to do with this? With the 2%?
But at the same time, you also have to be realistic. I mean, Nigeria has faced a lot of economic challenges. I mean, there've been, the price of oil, although it's gone back up again, but for a long time it was very low. I mean, you had the COVID, the problems from COVID-19 and so on.
No, I mean, Charles, if I may interrupt,
sure,
please. This Community Development Fund has got nothing to do with COVID. It's got nothing to do with low price of oil. It is 2% or 5% of the operating costs of oil companies. In other words, it's not federal government money. You are not talking of proceeds of oil. No. The proceeds in our system go straight to the consolidated distributable account.
Thing.
That's a different thing. Yes. The law says, look, you guys are operating here, we want communal harmony. And for the first time, we want the community to have a stake in stability and security of facilities and operations.
Yes, but
we give you a percentage.
Right, but it's still about investment in that region, isn't it? Because those people are investing in that region. And it's a disincentive when there's an additional tax to that investment.
Well, if it is what is more of a disincentive? Insecurity in communities, or a 2% increase in what should go to the community that will guarantee you peace, stability, and the buy-in. Now, in all of this, before you talk about the bottom lines of oil companies, before you talk about what goes to the shareholders, before you talk about government revenues, shouldn't you first, rationally, think about addressing the source of where this crude is coming from? Because without these communities, without their buy-in, or their continued buy-in, you can't even produce a dime.
Right.
So a sensible option will be to address that. And in any case, it's not the federal government paying. It is the operation cost. So if the communities have that, and you know, Charles, it doesn't make sense. It's a lose-lose situation for the companies. It is a lose-lose situation for the country as a whole. Because you are talking of hundreds of communities who now are aggrieved. Now you are like tempting people. Like a child is there, you bring a lollipop and you show the child and you take it back. Or you cut it into two. That's what the federal government has done. The 5% should have been the basic, barest minimum with a potential for increase. And we propose that. Put it at least 5%.
But is there the potential to increase it from 3%?
Well, that is up to the government. After all, it's an executive bill. So if the government realizes what they have done wrong, and they better do, the earlier they do so, the better. Because, you see, before you talk of investors coming in, before you talk of shareholders being happy with their investments in Nigeria, before you talk of all of that, any revenues, the communities must be receptive to the investment, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And because you are not even talking of one community, Charles. This is why it is a lose-lose situation for both the oil companies as well as the government. Because you are talking of hundreds of communities.
But isn't it a bigger loss?
And you've got no security capacity to enforce order and security and cohesion in all the communities at the same time.
But isn't it a bigger loss if there's no investment at all? Or at least there's a reduction in investment?
Well, if there's a reduction,
I mean, if you get your 5% and that's a disincentive for people coming to invest.
Yes.
I mean, if you've got 1 or 2 companies rather than 10 companies, I'm just giving you an example, who are coming to invest, I mean, isn't that a bigger loss to you?
Are the communities begging you to come and drill their oil and pollute their land and their waters and their seas? Are they begging you? They are not. You are the one whose survival and national economy, the whole economy, rests on oil that is in somebody's ancestral land. And for God's sake, you must recognize that, look, these are resources that belong to a people, that the federal government, through positive legislations under the military, all these legislations, which I call expropriatory legislations, were enacted by the military.
Right.
Not in a democratic dispensation. No. This is the very first time we are trying to legislate on something that should go to them. Back and forth, arguments, agreement, normal democracy. But all the laws that are vested, taking away these resources from the owners. What you call an oil block is somebody's ancestral property in the Niger Delta. So you've got to know that you are talking about the owners, not you, the Nigerian state is just an artificial, fictional owner. Because you have taken it from the people and vested it in yourself.
We've got about 30 seconds before we have to take a break.
Okay.
Is the Niger Delta preparing at all for the day after oil? Because, I mean, a lot of money has been pumped into the Niger Delta, and a lot of people who go there would argue that they're not seeing the investment into that region. I mean, are people there aware at all that oil...
Let me ask you, is Nigeria aware? Is Nigeria preparing for the day after oil? Do you know the trillions and trillions of dollars that has accrued to the Nigerian states from 1958 till now? Or forget about that. In the last 1 year.
Okay.
Trillions and trillions of dollars. Let me reverse the question to you.
Okay. Let me.
Is there anything to show that the Nigerian government has been earning that?
And that's a very good point.
Yes.
And let's take a break on that note. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Honorable Seriake Dickson, who is a senator in the Nigerian National Assembly and was the former governor of Bayelsa State. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. My guest today is Senator Seriake Dickson, a former governor of Bayelsa State in the Niger Delta, a region that was restive for many years and still has the potential to be restless and uneasy. For the moment, though, things seem quiet in the creeks, but not so in other parts of the country. Nigeria is currently faced with an unprecedented wave of different but overlapping security crises, from kidnapping to extremist insurgencies. Almost every corner of the country has been hit by violence and crime. As one security analyst put it, the scale of the insecurity threatens the very fabric of Nigerian society. And with less than 2 years left of President Buhari's final term, his promise to protect citizens from terrorists and criminals when he was first elected in 2015 rings hollow in a country that appears to be more unstable than it's been for decades. And Senator Seriake Dickson is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. You were finishing your thought on the PIB, because we're talking about whether or not people in the Niger Delta were preparing for the day after oil.
Yes, and I was saying that, look, Nigeria as a country is not preparing for the day after oil. And that in Nigeria, everybody knows, and you know that very well, that you can ask any government of Nigeria whether the oil revenues that accrues to it are effectively and efficiently utilized. I know one thing. I was governor for 8 years. I know that what came was effectively utilized. I know that the Niger Delta governors, that is one area you see governors working very hard, building roads, building bridges in very difficult terrains, building schools, building hospitals. I know that that is what is happening. It's not as bad as people may want to put it out there. It's blackmail against the leadership of the region, and it serves the interests of those who want to do so. Blackmail against the people themselves to say, well, we can't give you much because you are already having and you are not using it well. Who are you to determine whether we are using it well or not?
Well, I mean, there's got to be a form of check and balance, isn't there?
That is it.
I mean, this is, you know, you're all elected officials, you're all servants of the people. So
Yes,
there must be a means of verifying whether or not you're actually making a difference for the people.
Yeah.
But I wonder what you, just moving away from that, I wonder what you think just in terms of how the current Nigerian government is listening to the various ethnic groups, because that was something that the Niger Delta demanded for a very long time and had to take up arms in order for them to be listened to. Do you think a lot of people are shouting to be heard in this country and are not being heard?
Well, before I answer that, let me on this issue of blackmail, let me just, in a nutshell, let you know the what I left behind. Speaking as a former governor, I left after 8 years a state with the lowest maternal and infant mortality in the region. I left behind a state, as I was leaving, with the least public debt profile. I left a state that had the fastest rate of development in terms of education and the highest amount invested in the region on education and on healthcare. I left a state that had the most effective health insurance system and investments in healthcare. So that's about that. Because I'm talking of blackmail always about the leadership, and it serves the interests of those who want to do so at all times.
Right.
Now, talking about the ethnic and regional agitations, unfortunately, that's a reality. But in a way, if it is not violent, we shouldn't be too concerned, too bothered about it, because this is a large nation. And I keep telling people, educating people, about, I know a lot of people do not take time to study the history of this country. We are basically a nation of ethnic nationalities. We are basically, a conglomeration of African kingdoms who, before the British came, had nothing to do with each other apart from trade and occasional contacts with their own definite systems and so on. So coming from that point of view, from that time till now, and even from independence till now, we have actually achieved a lot of, a lot of cohesion. People live in so many places other than where they come from, and so we've achieved a certain degree of integration. But what has become worrisome what has become worrisome, is the feeling. And in these matters, you see, Charles, the perception sometimes is as important as a reality. The perception by some people that they are not carried along. The perception by some people that they don't matter. The perception by some people, maybe one or two, or even across the country, it's now becoming pervasive. Now, this country is such that whichever group, whichever party, whoever is leader, must demonstrate a capacity to listen to all, to carry, as they say, everybody along, and not to give anything that will suggest that the country is for one group or for a few. I think we have those challenges now, far more than any other time. And when you look at this on the backdrop of the high rate of unemployment, you know, because our economic systems have failed. Our governments are too expensive to run. And that's why I hold the view, which we may not be able to do that kind of exhaustive constitutional reform. We are doing some of it, but maybe not as fundamental. I believe that the country, we're spending too much. The systems we are running are damn too expensive. And now you have a high debt profile, where over 80% of what you earn goes to service debt. Which nation survives like that? Look at the bureaucracy. Unnecessary bureaucracy, unwieldy, and the culture of dependence and indolence and lack of productivity. So we've got a big problem.
But that's not just on the federal level.
No, it's at all levels.
Right.
And that's why I'm talking of the systems. And then you have the collapse of security. Collapse of security. From what happened in Libya, the collapse of states around us in the Sahel, and the drought situation, which has now led to all these kinds of headers and so on, clashing and leading to all kinds of insinuations. And then the collapse, the incapacity of the federal government itself to have the resources to allocate to its areas of primary responsibility, i.e., national security, defense, and stability. That is the number one obligation of the Federation. And then diplomacy and so on. Rather, because of our unwieldy system that we are running, a so-called unitary state that is called federal, only in name, the Federation is bogged down with a lot of responsibilities and duties that it cannot perform and powers it does not need.
And that's why you believe in devolution.
Oh yes, that's why you must devolve. I'm in the Constitutional Review Committee as well, and my colleagues, the chairman of the Constitutional Review is doing a great job, the Deputy Senate President, and the leadership that is there, and all of us are working very hard. In fact, I share a small subcommittee on policing reform.
I was going to ask you about policing.
Yeah,
because
which is key.
You were a former police officer.
Yes, I'm proud to have been a policeman, and I consider myself a policeman any day. And you see, you can't talk of national security, as I've always said, without fixing the police. And it goes beyond saying there shall be Nigeria police force in your constitution. You've got to talk of how it is properly structured to carry along the other tiers of leadership, including the traditional rulers, because they have a role to play. The traditional rulers are the real owners of this land we call Nigeria. The British came, displaced them. The Nigerian nation from 2014
We've
came.
got 10 seconds.
And then they too were displaced. We've got to find a role for them. And one of the areas they can be useful to our people is security. So policing is key.
I want to thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolute delight talking with you.
Thank you for having me, and
Seriake
thank you for
Dickson.
the great job you and your colleagues are doing.
Thank you very much
Thank you
indeed.
very much.
That's it for this edition of The Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.